Have you ever wondered how a chance encounter could change lives forever? In the cold routine of an ordinary day, a woman surrounded by luxury and loneliness crosses paths with an abandoned boy whose eyes hide a pain far greater than he. This is a story of secrets, sacrifices, and second chances, bound by a destiny no one could foresee. Watch until the end, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching from. The corridors shimmered with the glow of polished floors reflecting the warm neon lights. Alice's confident heels echoed through the bustling mall, her every step precise, calculated, and yet purposeless. She wasn't shopping. She wasn't even looking for anything. For Alice, a successful businesswoman draped in tailored elegance, the mall was merely a distraction, a backdrop for the isolation that her wealth couldn't erase. Through the glint of luxury watches and designer handbags displayed in towering glass cases, Alice caught sight of something entirely out of place. There, in a shadowed corner near the edge of the atrium, sat a boy, no older than 6 or 7. His small frame hunched over a battered backpack, his wide, solemn eyes fixed on the floor as though he were lost in a world far from this opulent setting. Alice paused, her finely manicured hand instinctively brushing the leather strap of her purse. She debated whether to approach him, hesitating until an invisible pull brought her closer. It wasn't pity. It was something deeper, a whisper of intuition she didn't yet understand. "Hello there," she said softly, crouching to meet his eye level. Her usually sharp and commanding tone softened into one she barely recognized as her own. "Are you okay? Are you waiting for someone?" The boy looked up, startled, his doe-like eyes meeting hers. For a moment he didn't respond, as though words themselves had abandoned him. Finally, he spoke, his voice so faint it was almost a whisper. "I'm waiting for my parents, but I don't think they're coming back." The weight of his words struck Alice like a sudden chill. She straightened, glancing around for any sign of adults nearby, someone who could possibly be looking for a child. But the mall was alive only with the hum of strangers, indifferent and oblivious. "What do you mean?" she asked gently. "How long have you been waiting here?" The boy shrugged, his tiny shoulders barely moving under the oversized sweater he wore. Then, gripping the fraying strap of his backpack tighter, he let out words that would haunt her. "They said I'm a problem that needs to be solved." Alice froze, her breath catching in her throat. Shock gave way to a wave of outrage, but she forced herself to remain composed for the boy's sake. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice as calm as she could make it. "Peter," he replied. "Well, Peter, you don't have to wait here alone anymore," Alice said, offering her hand. "Let's get you something to eat, and we can figure this out together." Peter hesitated, his gaze flickering between her outstretched hand and her face, searching for some hidden motive. After a long pause, he reached out and placed his small, cold hand in her. Alice felt a strange mix of emotions flood her, a sense of duty, a pang of sadness, and a fierce determination she hadn't felt in years. As they walked toward the food court, Alice glanced down at him, her mind racing. What kind of parents would abandon a child? And why did it feel like this meeting was something she was destined for? The clatter of utensils and the hum of chatter in the food court surrounded Alice and Peter as they sat at a small, tucked-away table. The contrast between the busy world around them and the silence between them was palpable. Alice placed a tray of food in front of the boy, her hands lingering for a moment as if ensuring he truly had what he needed. Peter stared at the food, a sandwich, a carton of milk, and a small apple pie, with suspicion rather than hunger. Alice noticed his hesitance and offered him a soft smile, trying to put him at ease. "It's all right. Eat as much as you want," she said, her voice gentle but firm. Peter picked up the sandwich, his movements slow, deliberate. He took a small bite, chewing quietly as Alice studied him. His face, so young, carried a weight far beyond his years. His silence wasn't just that of a shy child. It was the silence of someone who had learned not to expect kindness. Alice broke the quiet. "Peter, can you tell me a little more about what happened? I want to help, but I need to understand." He set the sandwich down, his small hands trembling slightly. They didn't want me anymore," he said, his voice breaking. "They said it was too hard, that I was too hard." Alice leaned in closer, her heart aching at his words. "Who are they?" "Your parents." Peter hesitated, his eyes darting around as if afraid someone might overhear. Finally, he nodded. My My adoptive parents. The revelation hit Alice like a wave. He wasn't just abandoned. He was cast aside by people who were supposed to offer him a second chance at a family. Do you remember when they left you here? Did they say anything? Peter reached for his backpack, pulling out a crumpled piece of paper. He handed it to Alice with a reluctance that suggested he already knew what it said, even if he hadn't fully understood it. She unfolded the note carefully, smoothing the creases. The message was short, written in hurried, almost illegible handwriting. We can't do this anymore. He deserves better. We hope someone will take care of him. Alice read the note twice, her breath catching at the coldness of the anger rose in her chest, but she suppressed it, knowing she needed to stay calm for Peter. Folding the note back into its original shape, she handed it to him with a forced calm. Do you have any other family? Anyone else who might take care of you? He shook his head. No, they said I didn't. Alice sat back, her mind racing. She had entered the mall that day expecting nothing more than another empty afternoon. Now, she was faced with a situation far beyond anything she could have anticipated. Abandoning Peter, like the others had, was unthinkable. But what could she do? She wasn't equipped for this. Yet, looking at him, she felt a responsibility she couldn't ignore. All right, Peter, she said, her tone decisive. You're coming with me, just for tonight. We'll figure things out tomorrow. Peter's eyes widened. Are you sure? You don't even know me. Alice reached across the table and placed her hand over his. I don't need to know everything about you to know that you don't deserve to be alone. For the first time, Peter's expression softened, and he gave her the smallest of nods. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a start. Alice gathered their things, and together they left the food court, stepping into a world that felt uncertain for both of them. As they exited the mall, the crisp air hit their faces, and Alice glanced down at Peter walking beside her. Her world of luxury and solitude had just been disrupted, and she had no idea how much her life was about to change. The drive to Alice's home was quiet, filled only with the low hum of the car engine and the occasional glance she cast toward Peter, who sat stiffly in the passenger seat. His small hands clutched the strap of his backpack as though it were his only lifeline. Alice wanted to speak, to reassure him, but she struggled to find the right words. What could she possibly say to a boy whose trust had been so deeply betrayed? When they pulled into the driveway of her home, Peter's eyes widened. The sprawling mansion, with its tall iron gates and manicured gardens, loomed ahead like a palace. Alice pressed a button on the dashboard, and the gates opened slowly, revealing a long driveway that led to the entrance of her house. The headlights illuminated the pristine exterior, with its stone facade and arched windows glowing softly against. Peter stared silently. Peter. His expression unreadable. To Alice, the mansion was just a house, a place that, despite its grandeur, felt hollow. But to Peter, it was something entirely different. Alice parked the car and turned to him. This is where I live, she said softly. It's not much, but it's safe, and you'll be comfortable here. Peter blinked, clearly at a loss for words. He followed her out of the car, his backpack still slung over his shoulder, and stood awkwardly as Alice unlocked the front door. The house opened into a grand foyer with polished marble floors and a sweeping staircase. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the space, but the silence inside was deafening. Peter hesitated on the threshold, as though he didn't belong. Alice noticed his reluctance and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Come on in, Peter. This is your home for as long as you need it. He stepped inside cautiously, his small frame dwarfed by the opulence surrounding him. His eyes darted from the towering ceilings to the intricate details of the furniture, as if he were afraid to touch anything. Are you hungry? Alice asked, breaking the silence. I can make you something. Peter shook his head. I'm fine. Alice nodded, sensing his unease. All right, let me show you your room. She led him up the staircase and down a long corridor, the soft carpet muffling their footsteps. She opened the door to a guest room, revealing a space that was both luxurious and inviting. The bed was large, dressed with plush bedding in neutral tones. A small desk sat by the window, and a cozy armchair was positioned in the corner. It was far more than Peter had ever known. This will be your room, Alice said, stepping aside to let him enter. The bathroom is just down the hall. If you need anything at all, just let me know, all right? Peter nodded, but he didn't move. He stood in the doorway, gripping his backpack tightly. Alice knelt down to his level, her voice softening. Peter, you're safe here. No one's going to hurt you. His eyes flickered to hers, filled with a mix of fear and gratitude. Finally, he stepped into the room, setting his backpack carefully on the floor by the bed. Alice watched as he ran his fingers over the edge of the desk, as though testing if it were real. "I'll let you get some rest," Alice said, retreating toward the door. "Good night, Peter," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Alice closed the door softly behind her and leaned against it, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She had no idea what tomorrow would bring. But one thing was certain. Peter's presence had already begun to fill the void she had carried for so long. Peter, meanwhile, sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the unfamiliar surroundings. The room was warm and inviting, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong. He opened his backpack and pulled out a small, tattered photograph. It was of him as a baby, held by a woman whose face he barely remembered. He traced her outline with his finger, wondering if she would have abandoned him too. For years, Peter had trained himself not to hope, but as he lay back on the soft bed, the scent of fresh linen enveloping him, he allowed himself, for the briefest moment, to imagine what it might feel like to have a real home, a real family. And for the first time in a long time, he felt the faintest flicker of possibility. The early morning sunlight poured through the tall windows of Alice's kitchen, casting a golden hue over the marble countertops. The house was silent, save for the faint clinking of a spoon as Alice stirred her coffee. She hadn't slept well. Her mind had been restless with thoughts of Peter and what she should do next. Every solution seemed tangled in uncertainty. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft shuffle of footsteps. Turning, she saw Peter standing hesitantly in the doorway. His hair was slightly messy, his small frame still clad in the oversized sweater he had worn the day before. He looked at her as though he wasn't sure if he was allowed to be there. "Good morning, Peter," Alice said, smiling gently. "Did you sleep well?" Peter shrugged, his gaze dropping to the floor. "The bed was soft," he murmured, as though admitting even that much was a risk. "I'm glad," she replied, trying to keep her tone light. "Come, sit down. I made some breakfast." Peter hesitated, but eventually padded over to the table, where a plate of toast, scrambled eggs, and fruit waited for him. He sat stiffly, his hands resting on his lap as he glanced at the food. "You don't have to eat it all," Alice said, sensing his apprehension. "Just have as much as you'd like." Peter picked up a piece of toast and nibbled at it quietly. Alice watched him, her heart aching at how guarded he seemed. She wondered how long it had been since someone had simply cared for him without expecting anything in return. As Peter ate, Alice decided to broach the subject that had been weighing on her. "Peter," she began cautiously, "yesterday you mentioned your adoptive parents. Do you remember how you came to live with them?" Peter stopped chewing, his hand frozen mid-air. He set the toast down and wiped his hands on his sweater. "Not really," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just remember. Before them, there was a woman." Alice leaned forward, her interest piqued. "A woman? Was she your mother?" Peter nodded slowly, his eyes distant. "She used to sing to me. I think she loved me, but one day she just wasn't there anymore." The simplicity of his words carried a profound sadness, and Alice felt a pang of sorrow for the little boy sitting before her. "Do you remember anything else about her? A name, maybe?" Peter furrowed his brow, as though searching his memories. "Clara," he said finally. "I think her name was Clara." Alice filed the name away in her mind, determined to dig deeper. "And your adoptive parents? Do you know why they took you in?" Peter shook his head. "They never talked about it. They just said it was their job." Alice frowned, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to take shape. The hurried note left in Peter's backpack, the lack of connection he seemed to have with his adoptive parents, it all pointed to something transactional, something cold. She reached across the table and placed her hand gently over his. "Peter, I'm going to do everything I can to help you. I promise." Peter looked up at her, his guarded expression softening for a brief moment. "Why?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Why would you want to help me?" Alice hesitated, her own emotions catching her off guard. "Because no one deserves to feel like they're not wanted. And because I think we were meant to find each other." Peter didn't respond, but something in his eyes shifted, a flicker of trust beginning to form. After breakfast, Alice retreated to her study, her mind set on uncovering the truth about Peter's past. She opened her laptop and began her search, starting with the name Clara. It was a needle in a haystack. But Alice had resources that most people didn't. She combed through public records, adoption databases, and social media profiles, hoping to find any trace of the woman Peter had mentioned. Hours passed, and just as frustration began to creep in, Alice stumbled upon a lead. A woman named Clara Hart had once been registered as Peter's guardian in the state foster care system. The record was old, but it was a start. According to the file, Clara had relinquished custody of Peter when he was 2 years old, citing financial hardship. The system had deemed her unfit to care for him, and he had been placed with his adoptive parents shortly after. Alice stared at the screen, her chest tightening. The story was all too familiar. A mother forced to give up her child, likely believing it was for his benefit, only for the system to fail them both. She printed out the documents and leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. If Clara was still alive, she needed to find her. For Peter's sake, and perhaps her own, she needed answers. That evening, Alice found Peter sitting in the living room, his small frame curled up on the edge of the oversized couch. He was staring out the window, watching as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon. "Peter," Alice said softly, Alice, taking a seat beside him. "I've been looking into your past. I think I might have found something." Peter turned to her, his eyes wide with curiosity and a hint of fear. "What did you find?" "I found a record of someone named Clara Hart," Alice said gently. "It looks like she was your mother. She gave you up because she couldn't afford to take care of you." Peter's gaze dropped to his hands, his fingers twisting nervously. "She left me," he said quietly. Alice placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Maybe it wasn't because she wanted to, Peter. Sometimes people make hard choices because they think it's the only way." Peter didn't respond, but Alice could see the storm of emotions swirling in his eyes. She wished she could take away his pain, but all she could do was promise to help him uncover the truth. "Peter," she said softly, "if I find her, would you want to meet her?" Peter looked up at her, his expression uncertain. "I don't know. What if she doesn't want me?" Alice's heart ached at the vulnerability in his voice. "Then we'll face that together," she said firmly. "You're not alone anymore." For the first time, Peter gave her a small, tentative smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give Alice hope. She knew their journey was just beginning, but she was determined to see it through, no matter what it took. Alice's home office was filled with the faint hum of her computer as the early morning light filtered through the sheer curtains. A steaming cup of coffee sat untouched beside her as she combed through layers of information, her determination unwavering. Clara Hart had become more than just a name on a screen. She was a connection to Peter's fragmented past, and possibly the key to helping him heal. The records Alice had found were sparse, and many leads led to dead ends. Clara had once lived in a small, run-down apartment in a neighborhood that Alice could only describe as forgotten. Her financial struggles were documented in court papers, and her relinquishment of Peter was explained with cold, bureaucratic detachment, inability to provide adequate care due to poverty. Alice couldn't help but feel a surge of anger. How many mothers had been forced into impossible choices by systems that valued paperwork over? But anger wouldn't bring Clara back. Focused on her goal, she continued her search. Meanwhile, Peter roamed the house quietly. Though the mansion's beauty and grandeur impressed him, it still didn't feel like home. Every room seemed too perfect, too pristine, like a museum where touching anything felt forbidden. Yet, there were small comforts. The warmth of the blankets Alice had provided, the steady kindness in her voice, and the way she never pressed him when he needed space. He wandered into the library, its towering shelves filled with books he couldn't imagine anyone ever finishing. A single armchair sat by the window, and Peter climbed into it, tucking his knees to his chest. He gazed outside, watching the world beyond the gates. It seemed so far away, unreachable, like the life he had before. His thoughts drifted to Clara. He could barely remember her face, but her voice was clear in his mind. She used to sing to him, a soft melody that made him feel safe. Closing his eyes, Peter hummed the tune, hoping it would bring her memory closer. Alice's search finally yielded a breakthrough. An old social media account tied to Clara Hart hadn't been updated in years, but the posts told a story. Pictures of a smiling young woman holding a baby, Peter, unmistakably. Captions like, "My little light in the darkness," tugged at Alice's heart. Clara's love for Peter was evident, but as the posts progressed, the tone changed. Mentions of lost jobs, mounting bills, and desperate pleas for help painted a grim picture of her descent into hardship. The last post was dated 5 years ago. Doing what's best for him. Please forgive me. Alice's breath hitched. Clara's pain was palpable, even through the screen. But where was she now? Digging deeper, Alice uncovered an address linked to Clara from 2 years ago. It was in another city, a modest neighborhood far removed from the wealth Alice was accustomed to. The trail was faint, but it was something. She printed the address, her resolve firm. Clara Hart might be hard to find, but Alice wouldn't stop until she did. Later that evening, Alice approached Peter with the news. He was sitting at the kitchen table, absently sketching on a piece of scrap paper. When Alice told him about the address, his hand froze mid-doodle. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with both hope and fear. She might not be there anymore, Alice cautioned gently, but it's the best lead we have. I want to go and see. Would you like to come with me? Peter hesitated, his fingers curling around the edge of the paper. What if she doesn't remember me? He asked. His voice small. Alice knelt beside him, her gaze steady and reassuring. Peter, no matter what we find, you'll have me by your side. We'll face it together. For a moment, Peter didn't respond. Then he nodded, his grip on the paper relaxing. The drive to Clara's last known address was long and tense. Peter sat quietly in the back seat, staring out the window as the landscape shifted from gleaming high-rises to modest suburban homes. Alice could feel his anxiety radiating, but she didn't press him. She focused on the road, her own nerves tightly wound. What if Clara wasn't there? What if she refused to see Peter? Or worse, what if she couldn't? When they finally arrived, the neighborhood was quiet. The houses were small but well kept, each with a unique charm. Alice pulled up to the address, her heart pounding. The house in question was modest, with peeling paint on the shutters and a faded welcome mat on the porch. It looked lived in but worn, much like the life Alice imagined Clara might have led. Peter stared at the house, his hands gripping the edges of his seat. Is this it? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Alice nodded. This is it. She stepped out of the car and walked around to open Peter's door. He climbed out slowly, his small frame tense with anticipation. Together, they approached the house. Alice knocked on the door, the sound echoing louder than she expected in the stillness of the street. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the sound of footsteps approached, and the door creaked open. A woman appeared, her face lined with exhaustion, but still beautiful in a way that spoke of resilience. Her eyes landed on Peter, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. Clara? Alice asked, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. The woman's gaze shifted to Alice, then back to Peter. Her hand trembled as she gripped the edge of the door. Peter, she whispered, her voice breaking. Peter's eyes filled with tears, and he nodded, unable to speak. Clara stepped forward, her hand reaching out tentatively. I thought I'd never see you again. Alice watched as mother and son stared at each other. Years of separation melting away in a moment of silent recognition. It was only the beginning, but it was a start. For the first time, Alice felt that perhaps they were on the path to something more than answers. Perhaps they were on the path to healing. The stillness of the moment lingered, fragile as glass. Clara stood in the doorway, her hand frozen midair, as though she feared her touch might shatter the reality of Peter standing before her. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks in silent streams. Peter, small and tentative, stared at her with a mixture of longing and fear, his hands clenched tightly by his sides. Peter, Clara said again, her voice trembling as though she were afraid the name might disappear into the air. Is it really you? Peter nodded slowly, his lips parting to speak but failing to produce any words. Instead, he took a hesitant step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. Clara sank to her knees on the porch, her trembling hands reaching for him. Peter stopped for a moment, then cautiously moved closer, allowing her arms to wrap around him in an embrace that was both desperate and cautious, as if she feared he might vanish. I'm so sorry, Clara whispered into his hair, her voice breaking. I never wanted to let you go. I thought I was doing the right. Alice stood back, her heart aching as she watched the reunion unfold. She hadn't been sure what to expect when they arrived, but this raw emotional connection between Peter and Clara was both heart-wrenching and hopeful. She gave them a moment before clearing her throat softly, reminding Clara of her presence. Clara pulled back from Peter, brushing his hair from his face as if to memorize every detail. "You've grown so much," she murmured, her voice full of awe. Then she looked up at Alice, her expression filled with gratitude and uncertainty. You brought him to me?" "Yes," Alice replied gently. "My name is Alice. I found Peter, and he told me about you. I thought it was important for you two to meet." Clara nodded, her eyes shimmering with fresh tears. "Thank you. You have no idea what this means to me." Inside the small home, the layers of Clara's story began to unfold. The living room was modestly furnished, with mismatched chairs and a faded rug. The walls bore signs of wear, but they were decorated with framed photos of Peter as a baby, his smile radiant and full of innocence. Clara noticed Alice glancing at them and offered a bittersweet smile. "I never stopped thinking about him," she said quietly. Peter sat on the couch, clutching a small pillow as if it were a shield. He listened intently as Clara began to recount her story. "When Peter was born, I was barely making ends meet," Clara began, her voice steady despite the emotion beneath it. "His father left before he was born, and I was all alone. I tried my best, I really did, but the bills kept piling up. I couldn't afford daycare, and I lost my job. Things spiraled so quickly." Her hands twisted nervously in her lap as she spoke. "When child services got involved, they said I wasn't providing a stable environment for Peter. I fought to keep him. But they convinced me that he'd have a better life if I let him go." Peter's brow furrowed, and he finally spoke, his voice small but steady. "You gave me to them?" Clara's face crumpled with pain. I thought they would take care of you," she said, tears streaming down her face. "They told me you'd be with a family who could give you everything I couldn't." Alice, watching the interaction, felt a surge of anger toward the system that had failed them both. She leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "Clara, the people who adopted Peter abandoned him. They left him in a shopping mall with nothing but a note." Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "No," she whispered, shaking her head as though she couldn't believe it. "How could they? I trusted them." Peter's voice cracked as he asked, "Why didn't you come back for me?" Clara reached for his hand, her grip trembling. "I didn't know, Peter. They told me I wasn't allowed to see you. I thought you were safe. I thought you were happy." Her voice broke, and she pulled him into another embrace. "I'm so sorry, my baby. If I'd known, if I'd had any idea, I would have done anything to get you back." As the night deepened, Alice observed the fragile threads of their connection rebuilding. Peter was still guarded, his trust something that had been fractured too many times to repair in an instant. But Clara's sincerity was undeniable, and Alice could see the beginnings of something she hadn't thought possible: hope. Alice excused herself to the kitchen, giving Clara and Peter a moment alone. She leaned against the counter, staring out the small window at the darkened street. She couldn't stop thinking about the failures that had led to this moment, the systems that had taken Peter from a mother who clearly loved him and placed him in a home where he was neglected and abandoned. Her thoughts were interrupted when Clara joined her in the kitchen. The woman looked exhausted but determined. "I don't know how to thank you," Clara said quietly. "You've done more for Peter than I ever could have hoped for." "I'm just glad I could help," Alice replied. "But the question is, what now? Peter needs stability. He needs to know he's safe." Clara nodded, her expression solemn. "I want to be there for him, to give him the life he deserves. But I don't have much. I've been working 2 jobs just to keep this roof over my head. I don't know if it's enough." Alice crossed her arms, her mind already racing with possibilities. "You don't have to do this alone. Clara, I want to help." Clara's brow furrowed. "Why? You don't owe us anything." Alice hesitated, then spoke with a vulnerability she rarely allowed herself. "Because Peter deserves better, and because I know what it feels like to be alone. If I can make a difference, I will." The 2 women shared a look of understanding, their shared desire to protect Peter forging a bond between them. "Thank you," Clara said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Alice smiled faintly. "Let's start with getting Peter the stability he needs. The rest we can figure out together." Later that night, Peter slept in Clara's small guest room, the first signs of peace settling over his young face. In the living room, Alice and Clara sat together, discussing ways to rebuild Peter's life. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they also knew they weren't facing it alone. For Alice, the journey had begun as a simple act of kindness, but now it was so much more. She had found a purpose, a reason to fight, not just for Peter, but for the chance to create a family bound not by blood, but by love and resilience. And for the first time in years, Alice felt truly alive. The morning sunlight filtered through Clara's small living room, illuminating the mismatched furniture and faded curtains. The house was quiet except for the faint clinking of cups as Alice prepared coffee in the kitchen. Her thoughts were heavy, a storm of questions and concerns brewing in her mind. How could she help Peter and Clara rebuild their lives? Was it even possible to mend the deep wounds left by years of separation and abandonment? She carried the 2 steaming cups into the living room, where Clara sat on the worn sofa, her hands nervously clasped in her lap. Peter was still asleep in the guest room, his small frame exhausted from the emotional weight of the previous day. "Here," Alice said, offering a cup to Clara. "You look like you could use this." Clara accepted it with a grateful nod. "Thank you," she said softly. I still can't believe this is real. That Peter is here. That he's—" Her voice broke, and she looked down at her cup, tears brimming in her eyes. Alice sat down beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "He's here," she said firmly, "and now it's about what happens next. We have to think about his future." Clara nodded, wiping her eyes. "I know. I just don't know where to start. He deserves so much more than I can give him. I've tried to make things better, but—" "You don't have to do it alone," Alice interrupted. Her voice was steady, but her mind was racing. She had spent the night thinking about how to best support them, and one idea kept coming back to her. "Clara, what if we work together to give Peter what he needs? You've been his mother from the start, but I can help provide the resources to make sure he has stability." Clara looked at Alice with a mixture of hope and doubt. "What do you mean?" "I mean that you and Peter should stay with me for a while," Alice said, her tone practical but kind. "I have the space, and more importantly, I can help you get back on your feet. Together we can figure out how to create a life where Peter feels safe and loved." Clara's lips parted in surprise, but she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked down at her hand, her emotions warring between gratitude and hesitation. "That's such a generous offer," she said finally. "But I don't want to impose. And what if Peter doesn't want to leave here?" Alice smiled gently. "We'll ask him. If he wants to stay here, we'll figure something out. But if he's open to it, this could be a fresh start for all of you." When Peter woke up later that morning, the adults presented the idea to him. Seated between Clara and Alice, he looked from one to the other, his expression serious. "You want us to live together?" he asked, his voice quiet but curious. Alice leaned forward. "Only if you're okay with it, Peter. I want to help, but this is your choice too." Peter hesitated, his small fingers fiddling with the edge of his shirt. "Will Clara come too?" he asked, looking at his mother. Clara's heart clenched at his question. "Of course, sweetheart. I wouldn't let you go alone." Peter nodded slowly. "Okay," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I think I'd like that." Alice felt a surge of relief and determination. She knew this wouldn't be easy, but it was the right thing to do. "Then it's settled," she said with a smile. "We'll make this work." The move was a whirlwind of activity. Alice arranged for Clara and Peter to pack their belongings and help transport them to her home. As they arrived at Alice's sprawling mansion, Clara stood in awe, her mouth slightly agape. The grand stone facade, perfectly manicured gardens, and towering gates were worlds apart from the modest life she had known. "I don't know if I belong here," Clara said quietly as she stepped inside. Alice placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "This isn't about belonging, Clara. This is about giving Peter the stability he needs. And this house—" She paused, glancing around the expansive foyer. "It's been empty for far too long. Maybe this is what it was meant for." Peter, meanwhile, wandered the halls, his eyes wide with wonder. He paused in front of a large window overlooking the backyard, where the afternoon sun glinted off a sparkling pool. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel a flicker of excitement. "This is really cool," he said softly, almost to himself. Clara watched him with a mixture of relief and sadness. She was grateful for Alice's generosity, but couldn't shake the feeling that she should have been able to provide this for her son on her own. Still, she resolved to focus on the future and what they could build together. As the days passed, routines began to take shape. Peter adjusted surprisingly well to his new surroundings, exploring the house with cautious curiosity. Alice enrolled him in a nearby school, ensuring he had access to the best resources and support. Clara, determined to contribute, began looking for work and taking steps to rebuild her independence. The three of them developed an unexpected rhythm, their lives intertwining in ways none of them had anticipated. Alice found herself feeling more connected than she had in years. Clara discovered a sense of hope she hadn't felt since losing Peter. And Peter, for the first time, began to feel like he belonged somewhere. But their newfound stability was soon tested. One evening, as Alice reviewed paperwork in her study, she received a call from a number she didn't recognize. When she answered, a curt voice on the other end introduced itself as a representative from Child Services. "We've been informed of Peter Hart's situation," the voice said, its tone brisk. "There are questions regarding his custody arrangement and the suitability of his living environment. We'll need to conduct an investigation." Alice's heart sank. She had anticipated challenges but hadn't expected interference so soon. "Peter is safe here," she said firmly, "and he's with his mother." "We understand that," the voice replied, "but there are protocols that need to be followed. We'll be in touch." Alice ended the call, her mind racing. She couldn't allow anything to jeopardize Peter's stability, not after everything he had been through. She knew they would have to fight, not just for Peter's safety, but for the life they were building together. As Alice left her study to find Clara and Peter, she steeled herself for the battle ahead. They had come too far to let the system fail them again. Together they would face whatever challenges came their way. And this time, they would not be defeated. The sound of the phone call still echoed in Alice's mind as she walked into the living room, her heels clicking softly on the marble floors. Clara sat on the couch, folding Peter's freshly laundered clothes into neat piles. Peter was in the corner of the room, building a makeshift castle with an old set of blocks Alice had unearthed from storage. His laughter filled the space, light and carefree, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in Alice's thoughts. She hesitated before speaking, not wanting to shatter the fragile peace that had settled over them, but the weight of the call was too heavy to carry alone. "Clara," she began, her voice calm but serious. "We need to talk." Clara glanced up, immediately sensing the tension. She set the stack of clothes aside and motioned for Alice to sit next to her. "What's wrong?" she asked, her brow furrowed with concern. Alice took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "I received a call from Child Services. They've been alerted to Peter's situation, and they want to conduct an investigation." Clara's face went pale, her hands clenching into fists. "Investigation? Why? Peter's finally safe. He's finally happy. Why would they interfere now?" "It's protocol," Alice said, her tone steady but laced with frustration. "They want to ensure his living environment is suitable and that everything is legally in order." "But Clara..." She hesitated, meeting her gaze directly. "They might question whether you're in a position to care for him." Clara's eyes filled with panic. "What are you saying? That they could take him away from me? From us?" Alice placed a reassuring hand on Clara's arm. "I won't let that happen. We'll fight this together. But we need to be prepared. They'll look at everything, our finances, our home, our ability to provide stability. We have to be ready for whatever they throw at us." Clara nodded, her determination hardening despite the fear in her eyes. "I'll do whatever it takes. I won't lose him again." The days that followed were a whirlwind of preparations. Alice hired an attorney to guide them through the process, ensuring every detail of Peter's care was documented and above reproach. Clara, despite her initial hesitation, began gathering evidence of her efforts to rebuild her life. Applications for steady jobs, proof of her intent to provide for Peter, and testimonies from people who could vouch for her character. Peter, unaware of the looming investigation, continued to settle into his new life. He came home from school one afternoon with a brightly colored drawing of Alice, Clara, and himself standing together in front of the mansion. He proudly presented it to Alice, who felt her throat tighten as she studied the image. "Do you like it?" Peter asked, his eyes shining with hope. "I love it," Alice said, her voice thick with emotion. She knelt down to his level, pulling him into a gentle hug. "It's perfect." Clara watched from the doorway. her heart aching with a mixture of pride and fear. She couldn't bear the thought of losing Peter again, not after coming so close to finally giving him the life he deserved. When the day of the home inspection arrived, the tension was palpable. 2 representatives from Child Services arrived promptly at 10 a.m., their clipboards and professional expressions adding an air of formality to the visit. Alice greeted them at the door, her demeanor poised and confident, but Clara's hands trembled as she stood beside her. The representatives began their inspection, asking pointed questions about Peter's care, education, and emotional well-being. Alice answered each question with practiced precision, highlighting the steps they had taken to ensure Peter's stability. Clara chimed in when asked about her plans to secure employment, her voice steady despite the weight of their scrutiny. Peter, meanwhile, sat quietly in the living room, his small hands gripping the edge of the couch. One of the representatives approached him gently, kneeling to meet his gaze. "Hi, Peter," she said with a warm smile. "Can I ask you a few questions?" Peter glanced at Alice and Clara, who nodded reassuringly. "Okay," he said softly. The woman asked simple, open-ended questions. How did he like living here? Did he feel safe? Did he feel cared for? Peter answered honestly, his words a mix of childlike innocence and hard-earned wisdom. "I like it here," he said, his voice growing more confident as he spoke. "Alice is nice, and Clara, she's my mom. She loves me." The representative smiled, jotting down notes. "That's very good to hear, Peter. Thank you for sharing that with me." After hours of inspections and interviews, the representatives finally left. Alice closed the door behind them, letting out a long breath as the tension drained from her shoulders. Clara sank onto the couch, her hands covering her face as silent tears fell. "Do you think it went well?" Clara asked, her voice muffled. Alice sat beside her, placing a comforting arm around her shoulders. "I think we did everything we could. Now we just have to wait." Peter walked over to them, sensing the heaviness in the room. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked, his voice small. Clara immediately pulled him into her lap, wrapping her arms around him tightly. "No, sweetheart. You were perfect. None of this is your fault." Peter rested his head against her chest, his trust in her evident. Alice watched them, her resolve strengthening. Whatever the outcome, she wouldn't let Peter be taken from them. He had endured enough. And now, he had people who would fight for him, no matter the cost. Weeks passed before they received the results of the investigation. When the letter arrived, Alice gathered Clara and Peter in the living room to read it together. The air was thick with anticipation as Alice opened the envelope, her hands steady despite the nerves coursing through her. The decision was clear. Peter would remain in their care. Clara let out a sob of relief, pulling Peter into a tight embrace as tears streamed down her face. Peter looked up at Alice, his small smile growing as he realized what the letter meant. "We can stay?" he asked. Alice nodded, her own eyes shimmering with emotion. "We can stay." The weight that had hung over them for so long lifted, replaced by a sense of hope and possibility. They had fought for Peter, and they had won. Not just his custody, but the chance to build a future together. As the sun set that evening, the 3 of them sat together in the backyard, the golden light casting a warm glow over the lush garden. Peter ran around chasing fireflies, his laughter filling the air. Clara watched him, her heart full for the first time in years. Alice sat beside her, sipping a glass of wine and reflecting on how far they had come. "It's not over," Clara said softly, her voice filled with both gratitude and determination. "There's still so much to do." Alice smiled, her gaze fixed on Peter. "We'll do it together," she said firmly. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it as a family." And for the first time in years, all 3 of them felt like they were exactly where they were meant to be. The weeks following the investigation were a mixture of relief and renewal. Alice, Clara, and Peter settled into a rhythm that felt almost natural, as if they had always been connected by something deeper than chance. Peter's laughter filled the once empty halls of Alice's mansion, his sketches and toys scattered across surfaces that had previously been pristine and untouched. For Alice, the house finally felt like a home, not just a showpiece. Clara, determined to rebuild her independence, threw herself into finding stable work. She began taking classes at a local training center, refining her skills in administration and finance. Alice had offered her contacts and resources, but Clara insisted on earning her way, determined to prove to herself, and to Peter, that she could provide. Peter thrived in his new school, his cautious nature giving way to curiosity and joy. Each day, he came home with new stories about friends, art projects, and adventures on the playground. But beneath his growing confidence, there was a lingering question that neither Alice nor Clara had addressed. "Why did they leave me?" Peter asked one evening, as they sat together in the living room. He was curled up beside Clara, his head resting on her shoulder. Clara froze, her heart breaking all over again. She looked to Alice for support, who nodded gently, encouraging her to be honest. They didn't know how to take care of you," Clara said carefully, choosing her words with precision. "They thought they were doing what was best by adopting you. But they were wrong, Peter. They should have loved you the way you deserved. And when they didn't, that wasn't your fault." Peter looked up at her, his young face serious. "But why didn't they come back?" Clara's voice cracked. "Because they didn't see how special you are. But that doesn't matter anymore, because you have us now. We'll never let you feel unwanted again." Peter nodded slowly, his small hand reaching for her. "I'm glad I have you and Alice," he said softly. Alice smiled, her chest tightening with emotion. "We're glad we have you too." As the months passed, their lives continued to transform. Alice, inspired by the experience of helping Peter and Clara, began exploring ways to make a broader impact. She contacted local organizations that supported foster children and families in need, using her wealth and influence to create new programs aimed at providing resources and opportunities. It wasn't enough to change one life. She wanted to change many. One afternoon, Alice invited Clara and Peter to her study to share an idea that had been forming in her mind. Clara entered cautiously, still unaccustomed to the grandeur of Alice's home office, while Peter bounced in, his usual shyness replaced by excitement. "I've been thinking," Alice began, gesturing for them to sit. "What if we started something together? A foundation, maybe. Something that could help other children like Peter. And mothers like you, Clara." Clara blinked in surprise. "A foundation? What would that even look like?" Alice smiled, her enthusiasm lighting up her face. "We could provide financial support, mentorship programs, legal aid, whatever it takes to keep families together and help children find safe, loving homes. You've been through the system, Clara. You know where it fails. And Peter, your story could inspire so many people." Peter tilted his head, considering her words. "We'd help kids who don't have moms or dads?" "Yes," Alice said warmly. "Kids who feel alone like you did. We'd make sure they know they're not forgotten." Clara's eyes shimmered with emotion. "Alice, that's incredible. But I don't know if I'm the right person for something like this." Alice reached for her hand. "You're exactly the right person. You've lived it, Clara. You understand better than anyone what these families need. Together, we can make a real difference." Clara nodded slowly, a spark of hope igniting in her eyes. "If we're doing this for Peter, and for kids like him, then I'm in." Peter beamed. "Peter." "Me too," he said, bouncing in his chair. "I can draw stuff for the kids. Maybe we can even make a big house for everyone." Alice and Clara laughed, the sound filling the room with warmth. "We'll start small," Alice said, her voice filled with purpose. "But who knows? Maybe one day we'll build that big house you're dreaming of." But even as they looked to the future, the past had one final surprise. One evening, as they sat together after dinner, Alice's phone buzzed with a notification. She glanced at the screen, her brow furrowing as she read the message. It was from her attorney, who had been quietly investigating Peter's former adoptive parents. "Alice," the message read, "you need to see this. We've uncovered something troubling." Alice's stomach tightened. She excused herself and opened the file her attorney had sent. The documents revealed that Peter's former adoptive parents had taken in multiple children over the years. Not out of love, but to exploit financial benefits offered by the system. When the money dried up or the challenges grew too great, they abandoned the children, just as they had with Peter. Alice's hands trembled with anger as she read further. The couple had recently applied to adopt again, their past actions concealed by loopholes in the system. She couldn't let this continue, not when she had the power to stop it. Clara noticed Alice's pale face as she returned to the living room. "What's wrong?" she asked, concern etched in her voice. Alice hesitated, then shared what she had learned. Clara's reaction was immediate: shock, anger, and a fierce determination to protect Peter and others like him. "What can we do?" Clara demanded. "We can't let them hurt another child. Alice's jaw tightened. "We'll expose them, and we'll make sure the system is held accountable for allowing this to happen." Together, they began planning their next steps, knowing the fight ahead would be difficult but necessary for Peter and for every child who had been failed by the system. They would stand their ground. By the end of the night, the atmosphere had shifted. Peter, oblivious to the storm brewing around him, sat on the floor sketching another drawing. This time, it was of a large house filled with smiling children. Above the door, he had scrawled the words, "A place for everyone." Alice and Clara exchanged a glance. Their resolve solidified. They had come so far, but their journey was far from over. Together, they would fight for Peter's future, and for the futures of countless others who deserved a second chance at happiness. The following morning, the weight of their discovery hung heavily in the air. Alice and Clara sat in the kitchen, their coffee untouched, as they pored over the documents Alice had received. The truth about Peter's former adoptive parents was worse than they had imagined. The couple had cycled through multiple children, exploiting the system for financial gain, and each time the children were abandoned when they came inconvenient. "We can't let this continue," Clara said firmly, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "How many more children are they going to hurt?" Alice nodded, her expression steely. "I've already contacted my attorney. We're going to expose them and ensure the authorities can't ignore this." "But will it be enough?" Clara asked, her voice wavering. "What if they just find another loophole? What if the system lets them slip through again?" Alice's gaze softened. "It won't be easy, but we have something they don't. We have Peter's story, and we're going to make sure everyone hears it." The first step was to gather evidence. Alice worked tirelessly with her legal team, combing through records and tracking down other children who had been abandoned by the couple. It wasn't long before a pattern emerged. Each child had been taken in under the guise of adoption, only to be neglected, mistreated, and discarded when their adoptive parents no longer benefited financially. Clara, meanwhile, reached out to local organizations that supported foster children, sharing her own experiences and enlisting their help. Her story resonated with many, sparking a network of advocates willing to join their fight. Peter, though young, sensed the gravity of the situation. One evening, as Alice sat in her study reviewing documents, he approached her with one of his drawings. It depicted a courtroom, with Alice standing tall and confident, holding his hand. "You're going to make it right, aren't you?" asked, his voice filled with quiet determination. Alice's heart swelled with emotion. "Yes, Peter," she said, pulling him into a hug. "We're going to make it right." The day of the court hearing arrived. Alice, Clara, and Peter entered the courthouse together, flanked by their legal team and a growing group of supporters. The courtroom was packed with reporters, foster care advocates, and community members who had heard about their fight. The story had gained traction in the media, and public outrage over the couple's actions was mounting. The adoptive parents sat on the other side of the courtroom, their expressions a mix of defiance and unease. They had hired their own attorney, who argued that their actions were legal, if not ethical. But Alice's team was prepared. One by one, witnesses were called to testify, former children who had been in their care, social workers who had raised concerns but been ignored, and experts who highlighted the systemic failures that allowed such abuse to continue. Clara took the stand as well, her voice steady as she recounted the pain of losing Peter and the relief of finding him again. "No child should have to go through what Peter did," she said, her gaze unwavering, "and no family should be allowed to exploit children for their own gain." When it was Alice's turn, she spoke with the clarity and conviction that had made her a force in the corporate world. "This is not just about one family or one child," she said, addressing the court directly. "This is about holding people accountable and fixing a system that has failed the most vulnerable among us." Finally, Peter was asked if he wanted to speak. The room fell silent as he stood up, his small frame dwarfed by the imposing courtroom. He clutched a drawing in his hands as he approached the front. "I just want to be loved," he said simply, his voice trembling but strong. "I don't want anyone else to feel like I did." He handed the drawing to the judge. It was a picture of a home filled with smiling children, with the words, "A place for everyone," written above it. The judge's expression softened as she looked at Peter's drawing. "Thank you, Peter," she said gently. "You're very brave." The court ruled in favor of Alice and her team. The adoptive parents were barred from ever fostering or adopting again, and their financial schemes were exposed to the public. But for Alice, Clara, and Peter, the victory was about more than the ruling. It was about ensuring no other child would endure what Peter had. In the weeks that followed, the momentum continued to build. Alice and Clara officially launched their foundation, named after Peter's drawing, A Place for Everyone. It began as a small initiative, providing resources for foster children and families, but quickly grew into a movement. Donations poured in, and partnerships with advocacy groups and policymakers helped drive meaningful changes in the foster care system. Clara found her voice as an advocate, speaking at events and sharing her story to inspire others. Peter, too, became a symbol of hope, his drawings serving as a reminder of what love and resilience could achieve. Alice, for her part, felt a sense of fulfillment she hadn't known was possible. Her life of luxury had once felt hollow, but now, every day was filled with purpose. She had found not only a family, but a mission that gave her life meaning. 1 year later, the mansion was alive with laughter and celebration. The backyard had been transformed into a vibrant gathering space, filled with children from the foundation and their families. Clara stood by the grill, flipping burgers with a smile, while Peter ran through the garden with a group of friends, his joy infectious. Alice watched from the patio, a glass of wine in hand and a contented smile on her face. She had always believed her wealth was her greatest asset, but now she understood that it was her capacity to care, to fight for others, that truly mattered. As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Peter ran up to Alice and tugged on her sleeve. "Thank you," he said, looking up at her with a smile that melted her heart. "For what?" Alice asked, kneeling to meet his gaze. "For everything," he said simply, wrapping his arms around her. Alice hugged him tightly, her heart full. "You've given me just as much, Peter. Maybe even more." As the evening wore on, Alice, Clara, and Peter sat together under the stars, surrounded by laughter and love. Their journey had been one of pain and struggle, but it had led them to something extraordinary, a family built not by blood, but by choice and resilience. And in that moment, as they looked out over the happy faces around them, they knew they had created something that would last forever. A place for everyone. In this touching story of reconnection and redemption, a chance encounter sets the stage for a series of unexpected twists that uncover long-buried secrets and challenge the meaning of family. With each revelation, bonds are tested, hearts are healed, and hope emerges from the most unexpected places. This is a heartwarming tale of forgiveness and resilience, where love proves to be the ultimate force for change. What begins as a journey of uncertainty transforms into an unforgettable testament to the power of second chances. Will the fractured pieces of the past come together, or will the weight of truth prove too much to bear? Creating stories like this takes time and dedication, and your support means the world to us. If you enjoyed this story, all we ask is for you to subscribe to the channel. It's a small action that makes a big difference. Don't forget to explore our other videos for more emotional and inspiring tales. Thank you for watching.